Hello everyone. Today we are going to learn about the three ancient dynasties of China. We'll begin with what a dynasty is. So, a dynasty is when a family rules a country or region for a period of time, and that can be a long period of time or a short period of time. Below is a graph of the Chinese dynasties, and you can see that some of them are very long and some of them are very short. Actually, the Qin dynasty lasted only 15 years, but it was the most impactful dynasty. Um, when the ruler of the dynasty dies, another member of the family will take power, usually the eldest son. And when a new family takes control, a new dynasty begins. And some of the reasons a new dynasty can begin is because of the mandate of heaven. And that is the Chinese people believed that the mandate of heaven gave rulers the right to be king or emperor, and it meant that the gods had blessed that person with the right to rule. A ruler had to be good and just to keep the mandate of heaven, and when a ruler or dynasty lost that power, this meant that they must also have lost the mandate of heaven. So, let's dive into these dynasties. The first dynasty is the Xia dynasty. Um, Many historians thought that the Xia dynasty was a model precedent to explain and justify dynastic change in China. So basically, they thought it was, you know, a mythological dynasty. But further evidence of the Xia's existence has been discovered, but there's no written record of any of the structures found. So they couldn't positively identify them as Xia constructs. And so the debate continues on whether the first dynasty of China was a reality or simply a political motivated fabrication of later writers. So let's dive into the Xia dynasty first. It all starts with Huang Ti, also known as the Yellow Emperor. He is one of the most important figures in Chinese culture. He was the one who established Chinese culture, established a form of government which would last for centuries. He is credited for inventing musical instruments, developing the production of silk, instituting law and customs, and even development of medicine and agriculture. Now, this was all when the Xia were a tribe. With the help of Huang Ti's grandson, Yao, they became a dynasty. Yao helped defeat their enemies and established the first dynasty of China. Now, Yao had some serious problems during his reign. These problems were mostly because of the flooding of the Yellow River, which devastated agriculture, killed thousands upon thousands of people. Now, Yao had some help from an official named Gun. He appointed Gun to take care of the flooding, and he built dams and dikes that were supposed to hold back the water, but the Yellow River was too strong, and the dams and dikes were destroyed, and it caused further destruction and death. After Emperor Yao's death, Emperor Shun came to power and appointed Gun's son Yu to complete the work and stop the flooding. Now, Yu was different than his father. He decided to work with others in order to stop the flooding. He enlisted the aid of the surrounding tribes and had them construct canals which would work with water to lead it out toward the ocean. For 13 years, Yu worked on this new way of controlling the water. He claimed that there were too many homeless people who had lost their own wives and children to the flooding, and he didn't feel he should rest until the problem was solved. After Yu finally finished his plan to divert the waters, and it succeeded, Emperor Shun was very proud of him, and he placed him in charge of his army. Yu ruled for 45 years, and he established a stable central government and organized the Xia dynasty and its territory into 9 provinces, which helped govern their enormous territory and made it a lot more manageable. In the end, the last emperor was Jie, who was known as a tyrant, and basically he lost the mandate of heaven, and he was overthrown by Tong, who established the Shang dynasty. But before we get there, the Xia established their capital at a site called Erliatao. From an archaeological perspective, it only seems logical that Erliatao was the capital of the first Chinese dynasty, the Xia. Erliatao was responsible for defining the social and political framework, such as the court rituals. So, its culture spread over a vast area, and scholars don't believe it was just due to conquest, but rather how influential Erliatao was. Many consider Erliatao as the first cultural center in the Far East. And it was able to prosper so well while other cultures suffered, probably because of the agriculture. Multiple types of seeds were found in Erliatao. There was rice from the south and soy from the north, and in most agricultural areas, the population tends to farm a single cereal. This region in Erliatao grew at least 5 different types of cereal or seeds. This meant they were safe from natural disasters because they could rely on different types of seeds. When the river flooded, they could farm rice. And because of the farming methods, this Neolithic city was able to develop in one of the biggest urban areas of its time. Its population reached 20,000, and it was one of the biggest cities on Earth. Even though its buildings were built of wood and packed earth. And the buildings they created are just monumental. I mean, right here is the palace in the center of the city. And this is an architectural form that lasted 4,000 years. This layout of the palace in the center, surrounded by large walls, and in the center a large courtyard, this lasted all the way up into the Forbidden Palace. This was the model for the Forbidden Palace. And it's amazing how influential this culture was. You can see from this layout, there's a bronze workshop near one of the waterways that passes through the city. And this suggests that Erliatao transformed Chinese metallurgy into a specialized and highly codified art that was associated with the nobles and the wealthy. And the influence and power of Erliatao extended well beyond the city walls. It influenced villages and cities and other dynasties all across its territory. So the Xia were a lasting and monumental dynasty that caused basically everything we know today in Chinese culture. They were the beginnings of it. They were the foundation. So now we can talk about the Shang dynasty, the first historically confirmed dynasty. And supposedly the Shang dynasty began when the Shang overthrew the Xia sometime around 1760 BCE. And Tong ruled the kingdom of Shang, which was a vassal state under the rule of the Xia dynasty. And eventually, Tong came to see that the Xia had lost the mandate of heaven and led his people in revolt against the Xia Emperor Jie. At the Battle of Mingtao, which is the battle between Tang and Jie, it was fought in a big rainstorm with thunder and lightning, and this is where the Shang dynasty was basically established during this battle. Um, when the Shang took power, Tang began government-funded social programs for the poor. One of those included specially marked gold coins to poor people who needed to sell their children to survive the famine. The coin was issued so they could buy their children back at a later date. So, as the Shang territory expanded, more cities began to come up, such as Anyang, Shang, Yin, and Zhengzhuo, just to name a few. And the territory of the Shang was filled with natural barriers on its borders. There was the ocean to the east, mountain ranges to the south and west, deserts and steppes, which kept the Shang in relative isolation. And the Shang dynasty evolved in unique and insular ways because of these barriers. The Shang dynasty had many capital cities, such as Shang and Yin and Anyang, and this suggests the power and authority the king had. Cities were crucial to political and religious affairs, and they were the seats of administrative affairs, royal tombs, palaces, and even shrines. Common people were concentrated in the agricultural areas outside of the city, while more of the skilled artisans were inside and government officials. The border territories of the Shang were ruled by chieftains who gained the right to govern through connections with the royalty. But most of the land outside of these cities were based on a feudal system, a system in which duties were tied to land ownership and with sharp class division based on clan birthright. Uh, the aristocracy were centered around Anyang, which was the seat of government affairs for the surrounding areas in the beginning of the Shang dynasty. Now, one thing that was associated with the Shang and is most known about them are their oracle bones. The oracle bones were part of the Shang religion, but they were pieces of bone, usually turtle shell, that were used by the Shang in attempts to predict the future. What they would do was the kings would write their name and the date on the bone along with a certain question they might have, and then they would heat the bone up until it cracked, and then they would interpret the crack, and that would provide an answer for them. Um, these bones reveal a great deal about what was important to Shang society and often ask questions about war, harvest, and childbirth. Excavations of the ancient city of Anyang in the earliest 20th century revealed tens of thousands of these bone fragments and bronze vessels. The artifacts contained records dating back to the Shang dynasty, allowing scholars to learn much more about Shang life, such as their agricultural methods, medical treatments, legal system, and craft-making styles. And the writing on these oracle bones allowed science in the Shang dynasty to advance, as observations could be recorded more accurately. Now, let's move into the religion of the Shang. So, religion was incredibly important, and it extended not into just social life, but also the political and economic life. By the end of the Shang dynasty, the king was the only one who could interpret the oracle bones, thereby making him the head shaman. And the Shang religion was characterized by a combination of animism, which is the idea that everything has a soul, and shamanism, which is the belief in shamans who have the ability to communicate with the spiritual world. Um, they also had a deep roots in ancestor worship. Um, And in particular, the Shang kings considered themselves as divine rulers, consulted the greater god, Shangdi, which is the supreme being who ruled over humanity and nature, for advice and wisdom. It appears that there was belief in the afterlife during the Shang dynasty, which is very interesting because at this moment in time, the Egyptians were also a large player in the world, and they also believed in the afterlife. So, two cultures here at the same time believing in very similar things. It's very interesting. Taoism was thought to have developed during this time, at the end of the Shang dynasty. These religious developments included a belief in an afterlife and allowed one to call on one's ancestors for help. It also meant that the king, who ruled over the land, was not ruling by chance or whim, but by the will of the all-powerful gods and in harmony with one's ancestors. And this all-powerful god is an example of Shangdi. So now let's move on to Shang society and culture. So the Shang had rich roots in agriculture, no pun intended. But they excelled in agriculture because of the rich and nutrient soil called Les, which is on the banks of the Yellow River. And the story from the Xia dynasty on how the Yellow River kept flooding all the time um, finally got under control, but there was such a rich amount of water that it helped the agriculture so much when it was controlled. So they excelled in agriculture, but the Shang did have multiple famines during their rule. Um, but it's quite surprising when you look at how well they developed their agricultural system. But they also developed musical instruments. And many excavations revealed instruments from the Shang period, such as the drums, cymbals, and ocarina, which is a wind instrument. As I mentioned earlier, the Shang ruled in a type of feudal system, very similar to the European feudal system, but they just had such a large area to control, so they decided to keep this feudal system, um, kind of similar to the Xia and how different provinces were governed by governors. Shang society was surrounded by their development of bronze, and bronze was hugely important during the Shang period, and it was vital in their military expansion. The chariot that you saw in the beginning slide was made of bronze, and it allowed Shang soldiers to move vast distances at great speeds, and it acted as a mobile archery platform, and this was integral in their military success. The Shang were constantly at war, and the Shang king asserted their control over the areas in which copper was abundant. Um, a copper mine located 900 kilometers from the city of Yin provided the Shang with their copper that they needed to create the military that was needed to control their territory. The Shang, the ancient state of Shu, was a major ancient Chinese city that flourished during the Bronze Age. Many bronze and gold artifacts were found there, many of which were birds that were similar to the phoenix. Chinese tribes took the phoenix as their totem, which is a natural object or animal believed by a particular society to have spiritual significance, and they adopted it by it as an emblem. So we've finished up with the Shang, so now we're going to go to the third dynasty, the Zhuo dynasty. The Zhuo were the longest lasting dynasty, lasting from 1046 BCE to 256 BC. And it was such a large dynasty, lasting for a long period of time. It was actually split into two parts, the Western Zhuo and the Eastern Zhuo. And similarly to the Shang dynasty, the Zhuo had a feudal system of government, and they modeled it similarly to the European style of feudalism. However, it was a little different in regards to aspects of the fiefdom and fiefs. So the Shang were in power during the rise of the Zhuo. The Zhuo and the Shang actually coexisted, alternated between peace and war. But the Zhuo were not invaders. They were Chinese-speaking people who descended from the Longshan Neolithic culture. And King Wen of the Zhuo is credited with conceiving this plan to undermine the authority of the Shang and their leadership. The second son of King Wen, King Wu, built a capital city and named it Huojing. And in 1046, Wu led an army of only 50,000 people, troops, against a Shang army of 700,000. This battle, shown in the bottom right, is the Battle of Muyi. Soon after the battle, the Zhuo won, and the King Wu made 3 charges against King Zhuo of Shang, which were all transgressions against Li and Yu. And we'll get to that in a bit, but basically the mandate of heaven was lost, and the new king of King Wu of Zhuo finally established his dynasty. And this dynasty was never a wholly unifying realm. There came into existence a network of city-states from which military and political control spread over the surrounding farming villages. Any local leader who challenged the Zhuo was quickly punished by the army, and the regional delegates were closely watched. So now we get into Li and Yu. So this all comes about with King Wu's brother, Lord Dan of Zhuo. He came up with a set of rules to cover almost every aspect of the nation, religiously, politically, socially, and economically. And he thought of the reasons of why the Shang fell, and he determined that their downfall was due to the loss of trust of the people. And without the people's trust, the state and the government was doomed. So this is why Dan created a set of codes for people to follow. These sets of codes are known as Li and Yu. Li was about regulating man's behavior, prescribing the manners he should adopt when meeting with an older generation or a teacher or his ancestors. The function of Li and Yu was to bring harmony and peace even among people who had many differences. And at this time, the Zhuo spread over a vast amount of territory with different cultures, so they had to work together and work cohesively together, bipartisanship. This system maintained a social order and contributed to the stability of the 800-year-long Zhuo dynasty. The concepts of Li and Yu became the foundations of Confucianism. And Confucius said the purpose of Li was for harmony and peace. Without Li, we would still be savages, and no peace and harmony would be possible. This social order that was Li and Yu came under attack when King Yo was killed during a barbarian invasion in Haojing, the capital city. It was overrun and sacked by a group of northerners. Huojing was too vulnerable to assaults from the frontier, so the government abandoned the city and found the city of Laoyang, which became the new royal capital. This was a major turning point in the Zhuo dynasty. It marked the end of the Western Zhuo and the beginning of the Eastern Zhuo. Now, Like I said earlier, the Zhou dynasty was never a wholly unified realm. It was made up of these fiefdoms, or these city-states. They slowly emerged as powerful, independent, and eventually they started biting away at the Zhuo power, and eventually the Zhuo power disintegrated. The Qin state became a close ally to the Zhuo, and they also had a marriage relation with the Zhuo ruling class. By 700 BCE, the state of Qin in the west, Jin in the north, Qi in the east, and Shu in the south were the main central powers in China. The royal Zhuo domain on the central Yellow River Plain was powerless. Eventually, these city-states began to fight for control of territory. This sparked what is today known as the Warring States period. And the biggest part of the Warring States period was the spring and autumn period. But first, here's a map of the beginning of the Warring States period in 361 BCE. You can see the Zhuo here, and the Qi here, and the Qin. But then, as we go later, into 260 BC, you can see the Zhuo have lost territory, the Qin have gained a lot, and the Han. After the Warring States period, actually, the Qin become the first dynasty to bring together all of China. And after the fall of the Qin, the Han take that over. So the spring and autumn period, this was where military conflict gradually escalated, and war after war, the different states started to annex each other, and from the roughly 100 states in 770 BCE, there were just 40 towards the end of this period. And arts and philosophy flourished in China like never before, which is kind of ironic. In times of war, you wouldn't think so. Thinkers belonging to the diverse 100 schools of thought developed many ideological traditions. This is the time when some of the most important Chinese schools of thought, such as Taoism, Confucianism, and legalism, were born. But eventually, the Warring States period resulted in the end of the Zhuo. There were 7 states who were chief contenders that fought for the control and unification of China. The Zhuo dynasty came to an end during the period in 256 BCE when the army of the state of Qin captured the city of Chengzhuo, and the last Zhou ruler, King Nan, was killed. This concludes my presentation of the ancient dynasties of China. I hope you've learned something. I hope you've enjoyed. If you have any questions or comments, you can leave them down below. Thank you.